Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. Welcome to Episode 3, The Old 76 House. In this episode, I'll be speaking with Robert Norden, the owner and tavern keeper of the 76 House in Tappan, New York, which was built over 300 years ago, and it's New York's oldest tavern. It's also listed as a national landmark due to its historical significance, particularly relating to the role it played in the American Revolution. Just about 20 years ago, a colleague of mine who shared my love of history attended a banquet at the 76 House for his Revolutionary War reenactment group. He absolutely loved the experience, and he recommended that my wife and I try it out. So one evening we went, and we absolutely loved it. And we've been dining there several times a year for the last 20 years, despite living an hour away. The food, the service there is outstanding, and the history of the building itself is fascinating. So without any further delay, I want to welcome the man who knows the most about the 76 House, Robert Norden. And Robert, welcome to Your History, Your Story. Thank you for joining us today.
No, thanks for having me on. Thanks for talking with me.
Robert, can you please tell us about the history of the 76 House?
Oh, absolutely. It's a fascinating building, and like most great American structures that date back pre-colonial days, the history kind of grew with the time. The building kind of grew with the times. Our earliest section, a room we call the tap room, was built sometime between 1640 and 1686. And we know in 1686 that this room existed because that's when they began keeping the records for the town of Tappan in this building, which was then called Maybe's Tavern, or Maybe's Public House. And the Maybe family was a merchant family. They had several buildings in Tappan, but this was the one that everybody congregated in. It became kind of the public hall for the growing town of Orangetown. And Orangetown was the largest Dutch colony outside of New York. Well, of course, it was New Amsterdam back then. And this colony became very important as the air became rife with revolution many years later in the 1700s. This is where all of the leaders of the town of Tappan gathered and drafted one of our first separationist documents, which is known as the Resolutions of Orangetown. That's July 4th, 1774. And in the much newer edition, which was added in 1755, we had the history that includes Major Andre's imprisonment here. And, of course, we also had the very famous meeting between Washington and Sir Guy Carleton, wherein America actually received its recognition by the English that it was free and independent of Great Britain. So that's the long and the short story, to which I'd like to add a bit more.
Absolutely, particularly about Major Andre. That always fascinated me.
Major Andre is one of the most enigmatic characters in American history, and it's such a fascinating story, frankly, that many vignettes of his life have been written, and our first kind of motion picture that was ever made in America was actually about Major Andre, Benedict Arnold, and, of course, the infamous Peggy Shippen, who was kind of like the Helen of Troy of our Revolutionary War, a very beautiful young woman who caught the eye of a much older man, none other than Benedict Arnold. She was a loyalist and came from a family that was very well known as being part of the king's entourage. And, of course, Benedict Arnold was the most notorious general. He was kind of like the rock star of our revolution. Literally, people had pictures of Benedict Arnold, watercolors and so on, over their fireplaces. That's how significant he was to the revolutionary cause. And one of those pictures, by the way, was hanging over our fireplace in our tap room when Washington was dining, and a courier arrived and handed Washington the plans that were discovered on Major John Andre. And when Washington unraveled these plans, he instantly recognized the handwriting of one of his best friends. Benedict Arnold and Washington were very close. And that's how Washington came to the sure knowledge that Benedict Arnold was indeed a traitor. And he upturned the table he was dining at and walked over to the fireplace where there was this watercolor of Benedict Arnold and turned that picture upside down. And that self-same watercolor is still upside down over the fireplace in the tap room.
Oh, I love
We've
that.
since had to reframe it, and it's like preserved in argon. So the frame is not original, but the watercolor is. And we've had to screw it upside down over the fireplace because people keep getting up from their tables and turning it right side up until they realize, oh, it's intentionally supposed to be upside down. Like, getting back to Major Andre, he was a very well-liked person on both sides of the war. In fact, he had a very short stay here at the 76 house. He was held here for 3 days. This was not a prison. He was given a stateroom downstairs. We actually call it the prison room because that's where Major Andre was imprisoned for his 3-day stay. But Alexander Hamilton and Talmadge were living upstairs in guest rooms on the second floor. And the three of them took all their meals together. And Andre was so enchanting that Alexander Hamilton pleaded with Washington not to execute Major Andre because of the virtues that this fellow embodied. Washington, by the way, and this is just a little personal view, if I may interject my little opinion here, a much more politically savvy a person than we give him credit for. We think of him as a man that, bound together this ragtag army and held it together with discipline and fortitude. But we don't really think about his statesmanship much. At least that wasn't the story that I got when I was studying history. But with the execution of Major Andre, it was a very calculated situation that Washington crafted, I believe, kind of from the start. Here he had a man who he knew would operate in the code of honor that English gentlemen all operated under, or theoretically operated under, let's say. And so he knew that if faced with the question, were you spying, he would answer truthfully, yes, I was spying. And he would probably add that he was doing the king's business and, couch it in terms of that nature. But that is irrelevant. And if you're caught spying in, military terms, the execution by hanging was what happened to you. So Washington had this very circumspect trial for Major Andre when he was captured and brought here to Japan. He had a court-martial filled with people whose reputations were very strong. And to a man, they all were convinced of Andre's guilt because Andre walked into the church where he was actually being tried. The church still exists, by the way. It's diagonally across the street from the 76 house. And he walked in, and the first words were out of his mouth were, "Yes, I was spying. I'm guilty as charged." And he didn't leave any wiggle room for the tribunal to, cast a cloud of doubt. And Washington, after receiving this, condemnation of Major Andre, ordered his execution by hanging. Now, Andre then became the first aristocrat executed by colonists, and not simply executed, he was executed in this base fashion, really only reserved for commoners. It so undermined the social fabric of the colonies that not only did it transform our war, which we all learned was about taxation without representation, really was an economic revolution when it first began, a revolt against taxes and so on. Now it becomes a revolt against the treatment of citizens, and that all citizens are treated equal here. And that is, kind of how we feel our revolution was about, but it wasn't truthfully about that until October of 1780. And just 3 short years later, the war was over. And as we our takeaway from that revolution isn't that, we're no longer being taxed by England, because in fact, England was much more onerous on us, leading right up to the War of 1812 than they were even prior. However, in our own country, with the newly born America, we now have this idea that all men are equal and aristocracy is not only forbidden, but it's illegal. So that's a very unique change to our whole, thinking about our War of Independence, at least in my mind. And it also shows how Washington took this situation, which admittedly was very precarious, with West Point floating in the breeze, and West Point being the actual strong point on the Hudson River, the only thing that's really keeping the British Navy at bay. And one must also realize that the only operative military idea that the English had for the preponderance of the Revolution was to capture the 315 miles of fresh water of the Hudson. That was they were going to bifurcate the colonies. They felt the North would capitulate without much struggle. And then on the southern end, they would tackle that as time went on. So their only military strategy was really to capture the Hudson River Valley, and the only main impediment at that late part of our war was this fort of West Point, which was really impenetrable as the Gibraltar of the Hudson. So the story of Major Andre, getting back to the nitty-gritty, is one that ends tragically for Andre, but is very colorful leading up to it. This is not the first time, the time when he was finally found and tried and executed in Japan was not the first time that he was found doing things across enemy lines. And on the first occasion, he was put under house arrest, and he was under house arrest at the house of none other than Benjamin Franklin down in Philadelphia. And that's how he was introduced to this young lady known as Peggy Shippen. Through his association with Peggy, later in the war, he was able to communicate under a pseudonym. He pretended to be a ribbon and silk merchant, and he was kind of selling her favors, and they would communicate in a code between the two of them to have her talk with her husband, Benedict Arnold, about allowing West Point to fall into British hands. Now,
Andre, when he was imprisoned at the 76 house, and so that do you know specifically then where in the building that he was kept? Oh,
yeah. What's neat about the 76 is I came to this building as an architect to do the restoration work. And that was in the mid to late 80s. We had done the DeWint House down the street, and the folks who were actively preserving this structure, tasked me with being the site architect during the building process. And what was neat about this particular building is it was one of a very few early American structures that was actually surveyed by what was then called the Department of the Interior. And they sent a group of architects to draw everything from the molding to the footings to the actual stones that surrounded the whole structure. And so there were blueprints that were on file of this building that dated back to like 1830, like incredibly old, really neat. And the room that Andre was actually held in, is outlined in that that kind of floor plan of the old tavern. And then during the Second World War, I have to add this tidbit. During the Second World War, the largest staging area of Americans who fought in the Second World War was Camp Shanks, which literally abuts the property of the 76 house. So it became like very important to this Second World War effort as well, because all of this was kind of like the officers' club for all the men and women who fought overseas. They literally were marched down Washington Street, which is a street that dead ends into the front of the restaurant, and right out onto the pier, which they built in what was then called Japan by the Sea. We now call it Piermont, because they built this giant pier in the town. Literally, they were marched right out onto the Liberty ships, which used to turn around underneath what's now the Tappan Zee Bridge and load them up. But the reason I'm mentioning this is they added a small room during that time, a room that you couldn't even get a cot inside. And they took an old wood desk and they cut it in half and kind of stuck it against the wall. And they took a chair and they draped an English uniform over that chair and kind of walled it off with like glass sliding doors on one side. And they called that Andre's prison. It was kind of like a tourist attraction sort of thing. And it was later on they called it the commemorative room because it wasn't part of the original architecture. So when we did our faithful preservation efforts, we actually had to remove that room. And as I later became the owner of the property after the first group decided that their concept wasn't really getting much traction, because they weren't operating the restaurant as a tavern. It was more of a high-end kind of shishi New York style restaurant, and this is a tavern. It needs to be a tavern. And that's what I embrace, and it works, I think, well for my customers, and for America, period, because what I'm doing here is not serving food or, providing a way for people to, feed themselves. I'm preserving something that is happening in the self-same way that our forefathers used this self-same structure. It's a place where people come just to be together. They come to do business. They come to, have a great meal and a pint of homemade ale and all that good stuff, which is what taverns were, initially essential for, because, there's no point in having a town if you didn't have a tavern in it, because there's no point to go to that town because you couldn't water your horse and feed yourself. So to get a patent for a town, you need to have the tavern first. Another reason why we know the 76 house was here in 1686, which is when Tavern got its patent. What we're doing in the self-same space that Washington sat and was served, probably a very similar meal. Certainly our ale is authentic as well, though he preferred Madeira to ale, and Laird's Applejack to anything else. That was his favorite liquor. But it's one of the only landmarks in America that you can go to and do that to also. I mean, it's very special. And that's why I like calling myself a tavern keeper, because it's what I am. I am, this is what we're doing. When we're perpetuating something that is older than America itself, and just as precious as the concept that our founders of our country had with them when they sat in a tavern and fashioned our republic. Absolutely. Which is, I think, really exceptional.
It is exceptional. When I come there, when Kelly and I come there, I think the first time we visited, it was at Christmas time, and just the decorations you had up and the atmosphere, and there was a fire in the fireplace, and Benedict Arnold was upside down up on the.
Yeah, you remember that guy?
I remember, and I just remember it was such a charming experience and cozy. And being a history buff myself, I was just tickled pink. And I said, "Oh my goodness, we're gonna come here regularly." And then, of course, we told our kids about it. And as adults now, they go up. That's one of their favorite places to go. And I had a 50th birthday party there for me, and we had other friends up there. We've always enjoyed it very much. But I just get that sense of history when we're there, and I think about just all the transactions and the people who stood in there and made decisions there, and just joked or took care of serious business. It all happened there. And I did want to say one last thing about Andre. So when he was eventually executed, where was he actually executed in relation to the 76 house today?
Well, just behind the restaurant. It used to actually be part of the restaurant, property or what have you. There's a very steep hill. And from the top of that hill, back in the 17 and early 1800s, you could actually see Manhattan. And you could see all the way down to the Hudson River, which is why the next town over is called Spar Kill, because kill means river in Dutch, and spars, literally from the spars of the ships, you could see the spars of the ships in the river. So from that hill, the next town was called Spar Kill, but from that hill itself, you could also see Manhattan when the British were coming up the river. And that was where the execution actually took place. And they built a gibbet, which he could actually see being constructed from the small window in the bedroom that he was staying in. And that's what makes the last 3 days of his stay at the 76 house very curious, because he had lady callers, and he made sketches, and he finished writing a satirical drama that he was kind of working on. He finished writing that. And these are not the actions of a man who's condemned to death and is literally watching his scaffold being constructed day to day. He's having these very jovial and animated conversations with Hamilton and Talmadge, and the only person that wouldn't see him was Washington, who actually shuttered the building that he was staying in, a building called the DeWitt House. It was a farmer's home down the street from us, which is now a Masonic landmark. He was the only, person who wasn't enamored and drawn to Major Andre to such an extent that, he was drawn into this web that Major Andre seemed to be very easily or adept at throwing around people. But getting back to what you were asking, at the top of the hill, not only was he executed, but that's exactly where he was buried. And there is a stone monument that was erected by the English after the War of 1812. And during that time, as part of reparations between the two countries, Major Andre's remains were then exhumed and are now interred in Westminster Abbey in Speaker's Corner. And if you mention that you're from Tapan, New York, it's one of the few codes that you need to tell the docents at the cathedral, and they'll actually walk you into that very private corner of the cathedral. And you'll get to see the tomb that Major Andre is now entombed in, which is actually quite ornate and beautiful.
Well, that's interesting.
But he was transported in a little blue box. Yeah,
a little blue. But I heard a legend that his
not
toe,
about the toe.
About the toe.
I have seen the alleged toe, and it is convincing. We have the historical society meetings both for Bergen and Rockland County here, and every now and then it used to surface on the mantle, during one or the other of these two meetings. And I've since learned that the fellow, the quote-unquote keeper of the toe, has passed away, and he was a hoarder. And they cannot locate the alleged toe of Major John Andre. But as rumor has it, the undertaker who did the work of exhuming Major Andre for the English was not the highest. Was certainly he put in the lowest bid. Let's put it that way. So he was a little bit of a nefarious character, and as part of his payment from the English, he took the toe bone of Major John Andre and put it in his snuff box, and so we still have a bit of Major Andre still here in Japan.
Oh, boy.
But other people say it was a cigar butt. Other people say it was, I don't know. It looked pretty convincing when I saw it. But I haven't seen it in many years, not since that fellow passed. So anyway,
that's an interesting story.
That is the rumor of the toe.
That's what I heard, something about that. But I just wanted to just circle back real quickly on one of the other major things that happened in the 76 House, and that was the Orangetown resolutions. Could you just
absolutely. There are three things that I really want to drive home that happened.
Please.
There are Orangetown resolutions, which is our first Declaration of Independence, basically. On July 4th, 1774, the town elders of Japan got together, and in very couched language, they said, "We are still loyal subjects," I think is how it starts. And the end of it is, "We will no longer be loyal if you don't change." So it's in very nice terms, "Hey, listen, we're done with this English rule unless you come to terms with a more egalitarian way of going about governing." And a lot of folks have suggested, and I think rightfully so, that the reason why we began to celebrate July 4th, because July 4th, 1776 has no relevance. Nothing really happened on that day. Our Declaration for the 13 Colonies was written on July 2nd, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This document, which was actually sent to the English, and not only sent to the English, but actually read by them, unlike the Declaration of Independence at a certain level. And it happens at a time also. I'm sorry, here I am talking tangentially again, but I think it's one of the main reasons why we celebrate July 4th. But it's also, if you think about the timing, in 74, there have been skirmishes. Things are beginning to get heated. However, the war is not fully blown yet. It's beginning. By 76, it's a full-blown war already, and Declaration of Independence is icing on the cake. and a beautiful document it is, but we're already completely engaging the English army. So it seems like, an ipso facto sort of thing.
What I wanted to ask
in my read, anyway.
Yeah, I'm sorry. One of the things I want to ask you. So Tapan, from my understanding, at that time was largely a Dutch community.
Yes,
is that true?
Absolutely, mostly Dutch. Though interestingly, Haverstrud, which we now call Haverstraw, was colonized by 33 sailors put ashore by the Half Moon, which was Henry Hudson's boat. Now, or ship, I should say. And these men took local wives, and this is a full generation before the 1640 migration of Dutch to this area. So there was already a full-blown kind of, integrated community that was beginning to blossom at this area of the Hudson River. To which, of course, in 1640 there's a large influx of Dutch families, and then by 1680, 1686 to be precise, is when we actually got our formal town document known as the Tapan Patent. So this whole area was in full swing. Very early on. I mean, 1580 is when they began colonizing the area, which is. That's a long time ago.
Oh, yes.
But when I mentioned the three things, it's the Orangetown resolutions, the Major Andre story ending in his execution and the significance of his execution. And third, and not least, is the meeting of Washington and Sir Guy Carleton. After 3 days of tumultuous arguments at the DeWitt House, they adjourn, agreeing to disagree, and they have a very ornate meal here at Mavy's Tavern. Actually, it was provided and orchestrated by Samuel Francis, who was Washington's chief provisioner, and for whom Francis Tavern is named. He cooked this fabulous meal for Washington and Carleton, after which Washington was handed the plans of the British evacuation and the recognition by the British command that America was free and independent of Great Britain. And the two men got together in a coach and went down to Tapan by the Sea, again, as we now call it Piermont, and the sloop of war, the Vulture, saluted America with a 17-gun salute, officially recognizing America as an independent nation on the water. And it's May 3rd, 1783, or thereabouts, I believe, and that's our real Independence Day. It happened right here in our front dining room, which I always find remarkable.
That is, you see, so I don't know how many people really know that. That is an amazing thing. Yeah. I mean, that was the end of the Revolutionary War, and really the physically recognition by the British, and particularly coming from the Vulture, which, if I understand, was the ship that Andre was supposed to escape on, wasn't it?
That's exactly right. The task of the Vulture was to sail up and down the Hudson River, not to quite go as far as West Point, but to sail up and down the Hudson River and just harry the people, shooting grape shot into the tree canopies and so on, just to, present misery for no apparent reason to these, revolting colonials. And what happened to Major Andre, and the reason why, the Vulture moved off its course, was one lucky cannonball shot, which was like an airball shot from a cannon that shouldn't have been able to travel as far as it did. It just grazed the mast of the Vulture, and the grazing of the mast caused a splinter to fly out, which just happened to catch the captain of the Vulture in the eye. And he was so disgusted, he ordered the ship to move station and go downriver, as he was being tended to. And that was, one of many twisted turns of events that happened to poor Major Andre on his route to return the plans of West Point to the English.
Oh my goodness! And that little splinter, right? Had that not happened,
one little splinter, and it would have been a very different story.
It could have been. I did want to just go back to one other thing on when you were brought in as an architect to do some restoration back in the 80s. So how did that lead to you actually becoming the owner of the 76 house? Well,
the group knew of my background, and I grew up in Francis Tavern, which was my father's place. My grandfather actually named the tavern Francis Tavern. It used to be called Queen's Head Tavern. my background in restaurants runs deep, and so as they were opening, they knew of this. I joke about the restaurant business being a blood-borne illness. Like once it's in your blood, you can't get it back out. And so when they were struggling and unhappy with the turn of events, they asked if I had any interest in owning my own business. Now, what 20-something-year-old who's drawing toilets for a big architectural firm doesn't want to hear that? So I came up here, and they kind of made me a deal I couldn't refuse. And my dad was generous enough to give his blessing and then tell me it was the worst decision I ever made in my life. Which I have to say is not true. This is something that is going to live on after I'm gone. Though it won't be in my family. None of my kids want to be in the restaurant business because they're smarter than I am. But it'll be here, and I will have given basically my entire adult life to it. And I think that that's an important thing because not everybody gets to say that about how they spent their time on this planet. So,
well, Robert, just the way you tell the story, I could just tell the passion that you have for the history of the area, for the building, and not only just the stories, but that you're preserving it for future generations to remember the rich history that this area, the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area has, and places that are just maybe an hour or 2 hours away from our homes could be just an excellent learning experience for our children, for ourselves, and things like that. And I just absolutely love that. I do have a question about the restoration for you, though.
Sure.
What was the most interesting thing that you found during the restoration while doing it?
In the wall, remember back in the day, they used stuffed newspaper to use as insulation. So we found some really old newspapers, like crazy old. And they were always interesting, to find one that you could kind of unravel and read, and it was like really neat. But the most amazing thing that I found is behind the bar, in between the wooden boards, was the original Tavern license, which I have hanging now on the wall where there's like a little, we call it table 12. It's like a little nook next to the bar in the old tap room. And it's got to be like one of the first tavern licenses ever issued by the brand new state of New York. So funny because you can tell that the form is like, block printed, you know what I mean, that they were using. And, but it's fascinating. Like, I just think that's really cool.
What date is
find like the original one. It's like 1820 something, like crazy old, like, and like, really beautiful, flowery penmanship. I should really I'll send you a picture of that.
Oh,
it's
please
really
do. I would love that. And next time I visit, I'd love to see that. I have to ask you this question because I know people will want to know. So I was told at one point that there was a story about a ghost table in your restaurant.
Oh, I was going to say, before you even said that, I was like, yes, it's haunted, is what I was going to tell you. Well, we got 2 tables that are like hot spots. And like, I've been here so long now, I'm part of the woodwork, literally. And this table 11, there's this lady, definitely, it's like in a yellowy, kind of a yellowy dress. And we literally have pictures of this spirit or whatever it is, right? I mean, literally have pictures. But I've seen this person, like, it's kind of like, I tell people, like, they're like, what is it like? I'm like, it's like if I ran in the kitchen right now and someone quizzed you on what I was wearing. You'd be like, well, I knew he was wearing pants, but I can't really describe them to you. So it's the same kind of feeling. Like, there was a time before I had my hip replacement. I'm just kidding. I did have hip replacement. That's all another story. But where I used to tend to the fires myself, bend down, turn them off at the end of the night when all the customers are gone. And time again, after a busy Saturday night, I'd bend down, I'd shut the fireplace off, and I'd make a full-blown etology and relight the fireplace because there was a person sitting at the table just to my left. And the waiters would see the person, and they'd go behind the bar because we'd always offer, hey, you want a little after-dinner cordial? And they'd reach up for the Sambuca because back in those days, everybody drank Sambuca after their meal for some reason. And they'd turn around to see if the person was going to say yes, and there'd be no one there. This happened, I can't tell you how many times before we woke up one day and said, holy Christmas, didn't this happen yesterday? Or didn't this happen last week? Or didn't this happen 3 weeks ago? And then everybody's like looking at each other like, yeah, this happened like all the time. What's going on? Like, and then all the waiters who used to do all their bookkeeping at the bar, kind of looking in the front dining room, now they all do it in the other the whole other side of the restaurant. Late at night, they don't want anything to do with the old front room, which I find hilarious.
One thing I wanted to say was that one of our visits there with my wife and I, we walk in and we asked, they were going to bring us to a table, and the waiter said, the hostess had said, would you like to sit at that table over there that's known as the ghost table, or the one in the corner is the romantic table? And before my wife could say anything, I said ghost table, and I got in a little bit of trouble for that. But it's hard to I don't know if you trade it up. Actually, I don't know. we actually ended up the next time we went to the romantic table, but it's
there you go. See,
we made up for
as it should be.
You really answered kind of my next question, unless you want to elaborate a little bit. It was, how did owning and being the tavern keeper for the 76 house impact your life?
Oh, it had some positive effects and honestly some very negative ones as well, because you really, I'm very wedded to this occupation, and that's tough on a family. It's tough on a relationship because, how many weddings do you miss? I mean, I can't count how many christenings I missed, and birthday parties and weekend fun things that, my wife, who is an ex for that very reason, went to alone. Finally it got to a point where, it's tough on a family, and unless that baseball game is on a Thursday night, I'm SOS, So that was the downside. And the upside is now that everybody's an adult and grown and enjoying their adulthood. They respect what I do, and they're very proud of the restaurant and what we do here and preserve it. And it's kind of our family legacy, so to speak. And from that perspective, it's great. And what's nice about the 76 house, particularly in our community, is there's not a person that doesn't know it. It's such a neat, famous old structure. It's for my kids and my family and so on. It's kind of like, oh, you're the owner of the 76. It's like a little feather in the cap for them also. So I think that's kind of a positive. They're good representatives of what we're trying to do here too. So that helps. Yeah, and you know what? I get a good feeling when I walk in. When I come home, come here from home, and I open the front door and I walk in. It's like I feel I'm more at home than I am in my house. Yeah. That's the telltale, I think, for me.
And you know what? I always know on the way out, there's always going to be a little bowl of mints there to take with me as I leave.
Unfortunately, during COVID, we can't do that anymore.
No. Well, I got to say this, that I got to give another plug here for you, because not only is the history amazing, but the food is out of this world. And
thank you so much.
Oh, I've always had my personal favorite, and I think maybe with one or two exceptions in 20 years, I always get the Yankee pot roast with the Yorkshire pudding.
God, yeah. I always joke with my regulars, thank you for ordering the pot roast to put my kids through college. But it's amazing. We use a special cut of meat from, it's called a mock tender. It's like my own secret recipe there. And takes 3 days just to get the meat in order. We roast the bones for the sauce. That's a whole separate production, and then it all comes together with the homemade mashed potatoes, which the same fellow that I started working with 33 years ago. He is the self-same guy. He's like 5 years older than I am. And he's been making the mashed potatoes for as long as I've owned the restaurant. It's 33 years. The two of us come in the morning. He's the morning guy, and I go to the front of the house. He goes to the back of the house.
My mouth is watering right now thinking about them. And I know you're
a lot of butter in those mashed potatoes. Let me tell you.
Your staff too. The staff there has always been excellent, and we've never had a bad experience in 20 years and places we're going to. I have one last question for you.
Of course.
What kind of an experience do you want visitors to the 76 house to come away with when they leave?
That's actually a really great question, because truthfully, I want them to take away from the experience exactly what they want from a dining experience. For some, that's just a good meal. For some, that's a good meal and good service. For some, that's really atmosphere driven. For some, we have live music all the time. So for some, it's like, I want to support the local arts and so on. And for some, like you and me, that mix of history and doing what our forefathers did in the self-same space and being with people we want to engage is what dining out to me is really all about. And we have a chef who loves to blaze a culinary path, and that's great, as long as we do it in the framework of what a classic American tavern should be, and I think we do. And so everybody can take away what they want from the 76 house without taking away somebody else's enjoyment of their experience. Meaning, like, it's a great, beautiful, historic tavern, but it's not like some of these old places with the cobwebs and it looks dirty and scary and dusty. That's not what an old tavern should look like. It should be clean and presentable and well preserved and operate like a modern restaurant in an older structure that has a pedigree. Well, we have a pedigree, in my opinion, like no other. But that's what this restaurant should be to people. Exactly what they want it to be. And it's so broad and so appealing to so many tastes that it's very special, and that's why I like putting a key in the door.
Well said, and I can attest to that as well. I mean, we've brought lots of friends there who are not history people like I am, and they've come away with their excellent experience as well. So what you've said is actually occurring. So I appreciate that. And I want to thank you, Robert, for you're a gentleman, and you really run a wonderful tavern. And thank you from, I'm sure, many other history lovers who really enjoy hearing the story about such a great place and a building that still exists. And that, when you're in there, you almost feel the history in the walls. That's about the
right. It's like history through osmosis.
It really is. And just keep doing what you're doing. And again, you're located in Tappan, New York. And what's the exact address, Robert?
We're at 110 Main Street, Tappan, New York, and it's 76house.com.
Very good. I want to thank you again, and I hope you have a great day. And maybe we can talk another time about your experiences with a dad and grandfather who involved in Francis
downtown. Oh gosh, wax poetic about Lower Manhattan. I literally grew up in the fish market.
I can't wait for that one. But thanks again, Robert, and have a great day.
Oh, you as well. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. Please subscribe, share, and check out our website at yourhistoryyourstory.com for episode notes and bonus content. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well, and God bless.